Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes, and today we're going to go a little bit off the deep end. I'm in the process of recording a series of I don't know where the hell these are going, just stories, and I titled it, when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, I titled this Suicide, Carbs, Elon Musk and Recovery. kind of a bizarre story. In the last video, we talked a little bit about one of my patients and her story and her husband's story and her story of death and recovery. Today I'm going to tell my story. And I'm going to start with where I am. I've had some really, really rough times over the last few months, and they're irrelevant in terms of the triggers, because I live a really, really good life. But remember, it's about how we perceive the shit that happens to us and the tools we have in our emotion management toolkit and the influences of every day, not the magnitude of what happens. Clearly there's been, and I'm recording this right after Buffalo and right after Uvalde, awful things that are just unimaginable. Can you imagine being in the Ukraine right now? Those are the unimaginables. My life certainly isn't that. But and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but it happened. I was scrolling through my Instagram feed and I happened to see someone who I don't follow, but the quote popped up from her, Ellen DeGeneres. Like it or leave it. But the quote that Ellen put out right after all these shootings was that gun violence kills more children than car accidents. Gun violence is the most common cause of death of children. And suicide is the most common cause of death in children. Suicide. Suicide is the most common, unspoken of, cause of death of children under the age of 20. Suicide. Nobody's talking about it. The newspapers don't report it. Nobody talks about it. Every single day in my office when I see new patients, at least one time a day, there's a family history of a family member who committed suicide. Every day. They may not call it that. Drug overdose. Accidental. But every day, I see a family, I see a person who has been traumatized by suicide. And so often we see folks in our practice that have tried to commit suicide, that have thought about it. And I want to address this face on because it is such a common cause of death. And there are nuances to it. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about it. Commonest cause of death of children under the age of 20 is by their own hand. Think about that for a minute, folks. I just had 2 young people this week in my practice. One the child of one of my patients, the other one a patient of mine. Die that way. Intentional suicide. One was the use of a gun, the other was not. Have I thought about suicide? Yep. Yep, I have. And I've spoken to my wife about it. Why would I do that? Why would I even contemplate something like that? I got all my shit together, don't I? Look at my facade. Look what I show people. The facade that we show people is camouflage. What people see is the camouflage that is protective of our core, how we really feel about ourselves. And whether you acknowledge it or not, anyone with a vulnerability to addictive behavior, by definition, has a very weak, eroded sense of self. Our self-esteem, our self-confidence, our self-respect is in the toilet. Therefore, we have to use drugs and external mechanisms and narcissistic behavior and violence and aggression and anger and blame of other people to externalize how we feel about ourselves and to numb, soothe, and obliterate these awful emotions that we feel about ourselves. And even then, when despite our addiction, things go poorly, when we get depressed, when we get anxious, our brains just want to get away. How many of you haven't had those thoughts and haven't even, oh my God, how can I even express that to anybody? But if we're not talking about it, but it's happening more commonly than anything else in our youth, why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we talking about the fact that the way people feel about themselves, the way we feel boxed in, our level of anxiety, our lack of self-worth, not what the world sees. The world never sees me that way. But I am. And I bet you a lot of you are as well. Why? Why do we get that way? Why do we get that way? The primary reason we get that way, folks, is because more and more we have lost the capacity and the ability to self-validate. To self-validate. To look at silly, quirky little things that we do and say, hey, I'm proud of you for doing that. Me to me. I'm proud of you doing that. When we lose the ability to validate that we matter, to validate that we belong, to validate that it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of us, that we're pretty cool and good ourselves, that I don't need to say shit to you because it's not about you, it's about me. And if I'm afraid of what you're going to say and afraid of what you're going to think of me, then I keep everything bundled inside. I don't talk about my stuff because I don't trust that somebody else's opinion of me is not going to be derogatory or nasty or sting me. And if I can't trust you, that you're not going to be judgmental or critical of me, then I cannot be vulnerable in that space. And if I do not have the capacity to be vulnerable, to take the risk of being vulnerable within a relationship, within the space of communicating with another human being, all that stuff festers inside of me and erodes my sense of self even further. And that's where self-harm comes from. That's where self-harm comes from. Acutely, if you jump in front of a train or shoot yourself or take a drug to poison yourself, acutely, when you act on that feeling. And yes, those are the horrific suicides where somebody suddenly ends up dead or does something ridiculous and crazy, like killing other people on the way out, where you've just lost the ability to care, where you cannot communicate your angst, your anxiety with anybody else. That's not mental health, folks. Oh, it's a mental health problem. That's an acute situation. That's a parenting problem. That is a socialization problem. But it's quite easy for you to distance yourself from that person, even though you might have had those thoughts briefly, like I do, like I have, and like I'm sure I will have again. But there's another form of suicide, and that's a slow form of suicide. It's where we intentionally, not thinking it through, not planning it, but intentionally knee-jerk react and binge out on our drug of choice. When our anxiety builds up, our depression is so deep, our angst is so deep, and we have no outlets, that we turn to that sudden binge, that tub of ice cream. And it doesn't stop at a tub of ice cream. The problem with addiction is that it continues for days and days and weeks and months, until hopefully something slaps us upside the head and say, hey dude, you have some self-worth. You are worthy. You matter. And the most important place to find the fact that you matter is in the mirror. I matter. I'm okay. I'm not perfect. But how many of us are not contaminated and destroyed by the disease of perfection? We have to show people our facade. You have to look good. You have to have those ripped bodies. Your mind has to be sharp. You've got to be smart. You've got to be good looking. You have to dress well. That's the facade that we present to everybody else so they will approve on our behalf because we cannot self-approve. Finding self-approval. This morning my dog was feeding and he spilled some food on the ground. His bowl's a little off the ground. I smiled at myself and I said, dude, you know you're going to pick that up. And I picked it up and I put it back in his bowl. Stupid, silly little thing. But you know what? That was a moment of self-approval. That was a moment where I said, hey, I'm proud of you for doing that. Not angry at the dog for spilling, but proud of the fact that I was there to pick it up. A stupid, silly little thing. But those moments are missing because of perfectionism. Those moments are missing when we don't believe we're good enough. When we watch the internet, we watch Facebook, when we watch TikTok, and we see other people doing magical things. And you say, I am not that. Look how weak and pathetic I am. The other problem that I personally have is a huge problem with anxiety and flooding. A silly little thing. Silly little thing. A few weeks ago, my wife took me to the Kentucky Derby and we had the most wonderful time. And one of the things that we did is we got dressed up and we enjoyed dressing up. She loves it more. She is quite conceivably the opposite of what I'm talking about right now. She loves that getting dressed because she doesn't get dressed for you. She gets dressed for herself. She loves the way she likes to make herself look. That's empowering. That builds that core strength. She has the core strength that supports my pathetically weak sense of self. But one of the things that she did is she bought me a bow tie. I'm a surgeon. I can tie knots. These things work really, really well to tie knots. I'm damn good at it. I have to be because your life depends on my ability to tie knots. And I thought, bow tie, easy. So I left a little bit late. The bus was about to leave and I'm sitting there, I'm dressed, looking really sharp. So she said, because I can't see that. Think about that. I can't see that. She said, on display for others because I can't self-validate. And here I am trying to tie this knot. And I'm screwing it up. And because of the time pressure, my anxiety just started to flood. And I had a panic attack. Stupid, silly little thing, tying a bow tie. But it took me from a 0 level to an 11 out of a score of 10. Like this. Why? Because I didn't know how to say, hey, I'm going to be okay. You got this. I have no core strength. I have no core strength. And that's not self-deprecation. That's insight. And I flooded and I went ballistic and it was ludicrous. And eventually I got it right. Because I knew I'd get it right. But I was panicked in the moment under time pressure. Stupid, silly little thing. But the enormity of the emotional fallout of that, not just for me, but for the people around me. The way it affected everybody else. The way my anxiety and my flooding, where it's like a flood coming down. You see it coming and you can't stop the floodwaters. And you're paralyzed, you can't get out of the way. That's work I still have to do. I saw it coming and I couldn't get out of the way. There were so many other options, but I was locked in and boxed in because I'm inadequate. And that's just a simple example. There are much, much bigger examples. Much bigger examples. Where that anxiety leads you to think, I am not good enough. I'm pathetic. I can't even tie a bow tie. And I know it's stupid. But think how useless that makes you feel. And every one of you has those moments. And if they multiply, if they get on top of each other, you start looking at yourself and saying, hey, I really am not of any benefit to anybody else. How can I be of value to those people around me if I'm so useless? Look at the liability I cause for other people. And we as parents do that to our kids. Think about this, folks, because this is where it comes from for me. And I only realize now how wrong I was. How wrong I was in my perception. I now know that growing up, both my parents loved me and loved me more than they loved themselves. And as a parent, you know that you love your children tremendously, and you want them to be very successful. But how often do you not offer your children excellent advice that is completely unsolicited? And how often are you so focused on your kids doing better and your kids achieving more that you never ever consider the word empathy? What is that word empathy? It is where you stand in your child's shoes and you look at the advice that's coming at them. And you ask yourself, how is my child going to see this advice? Are they going to see it as the best advice possible? Or are they going to see it as criticism? Is their perception that this is criticism of them not being good enough? And if you are offering your teenage child unsolicited advice all the time, and your child is not reaching your ridiculously lofty expectations, if that perfectionism that you want your child to achieve, because you want them to do really well, is hurting them because they continuously feel that they're not good enough, that gap between how a child feels and how you want them to feel is a cause of so much erosion of sense of self. And if they perpetually feel not good enough, then eventually they are going to become what you've made them, which is self-critical. Look how pathetic I am that I can't even tie a bow tie. Look how pathetic I am that I cannot take care of my family properly. I owe my family this. And we sacrifice ourselves for our family. We sacrifice ourselves for the people around us, and yet we are not good enough. That's the oxygen mask theory, folks. We are desperately trying to show other people how good you are, how kind you are, how caring you are. Because you want them to favorably validate on your behalf, oh, he's such a good guy. But remember the oxygen mask theory, when you're flying in an airplane, and suddenly the cabin pressure goes down and 3 oxygen masks fall from the ceiling. And the kids beside you are going, can't breathe. And you're so busy putting oxygen masks on everybody else, you die. You die. The oxygen mask theory says put your own mask on first. And when you breathe in clean air, you're much more equipped to help others with their needs. But people like me know. We're so busy helping other people. We can't. We won't, we don't take care of our emotional selves adequately. And then we either do drugs to prop that up, doesn't matter if it's nicotine or carbohydrates or have that binge, or we plunge into a deep hole of anxiety and depression, and then we think, I am not worthy. And then we take it out on ourselves. Think about a child who doesn't even have the concrete or the abstract ability to think through this like I'm taking you through this journey right now. All they see is how pathetic and how useless they are and how their parents are criticizing them all the time for not being good enough. I am a wasted life. I don't belong. And then we do self-harm, either acutely or slowly over time, or a parasuicide. To show other people by half committing suicide how much angst we actually have and how desperately want their care. And if we are angry at how other people make us feel, then as part of our suicide mission, we take that anger out on the people around us while we are committing suicide ourselves. There's the problem. If you make me feel diminished, if you make me feel what I always feel, but I can't reconcile that and blame that on myself, then I take my anger out on you as I'm self-destroying. And we see that every day. We see that in angry people yelling and screaming and shouting and making up stories to make themselves feel better. Fake news. We see that with the violence of these shooters that go out and kill other people while they're committing suicide themselves. Because they want to punish you for hurting them. We see it in the child rebelling against their parents. And then we see it in the child or the person like myself, sealing ourselves up from others and destroying ourselves. Because we have lost the ability to be compassionate to ourselves. We've lost the ability to self-validate because we're never good enough. And as part of recovery, as part of therapy, self-validation, incremental self-validation based on the little things that you do, those little mind-cleansing moments, those little self-care moments. But they're effort-based. You have to put the effort in. You have to put the action in, because the return of the investment of effort is a sense of well-being if you allow it to be. But if you contaminate it by perfectionism, it loses its meaning. And I am that person. I struggle. I try really hard. But there are days when even that doesn't work. And those are days where we flood, where we get anxious, where the anxiety level goes through the roof and nobody can understand why, not even ourselves. Or we get so depressed, we're so down, all we want to do is stay in bed or hide in front of the TV. We want to hide away. We want to close ourselves up. Those are dysfunctional ways of not taking care of ourselves. That's carb addiction, folks. Haven't talked about food, haven't talked about anything else. Now, here's an interesting thing, because this is a little bit of a paradox. Let's talk about my friend Elon Musk, wealthiest man in the world, who doesn't give a shit, doesn't care. That's the beauty about Elon. So many of these other billionaires, it's all about the money. It's all about making that money. It's all about buying things and having stuff. And if you look at yourself, you don't have to be Elon Musk wealth, but everybody lives in a world of stuff, of self. I'll take you down that road in a few minutes because it's a great way to recover. Watch tomorrow's video. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. I hope I've touched you deep inside. I'm no different than you. I'm fighting the same battles. But know together we can survive.